But why did therapists lose their way? I think it became a culture, it became an industry. I thought Abigail Shrier's book, Bad Therapy, was brilliant. How we all became pseudo psychologists and pop psychologists and all the, the magazines from the 80s and 90s. It was always psychology, and everybody was kind of this half-baked idea of what's going on for you. And I think it's become so popular that everybody's become a therapist, and then now nobody's a therapist. And the idea there was a concept creep from therapeutic process to therapeutic support. And a process is something that somebody would come to me for, which is you commit to a process. It's going to be difficult. It will cost you usually, and you will be committed maybe every week and maybe for at least 6 months, certainly for a certain level of time. And it'll be arduous. It'll be an event in your life. It should be a big event in your life. It should be life changing. And therapeutic support, which is what it's kind of crept into as a concept, it's a very different idea. It's making me a facilitator where I'm just nodding along. I remember when I was learning to be a therapist, when I was training, my lecturer talking about don't be a nodding dog, and she used to talk about the nodding dog therapists, and I was like, oh my God, they're awful. I remember them. They just nod along to everything you say. Effectively, she was talking about affirmative therapists before we were calling it nodding dog. We were very dismissive, and I knew exactly what she was talking about. It was one of the reasons why I became a therapist, because they were just nodding along. They weren't engaged. I could have said, I'm going off to the South Pole, and they'd nod. And then I'd say, no, I'm going to live in Mexico. They'd nod. I'm going to leave my husband. They'd nod. There was just no challenge. And it was actually very alienating and pretty depressing, and I hated it.
First came the parents for help. Then came the detransitioners for help. Then came the opposition from every side. Strangely, the big right-wing evangelical culture war money never did show up, but still she persisted. Psychotherapist and author Stella O'Malley tells us about Genspect, the organization she founded to promote non-medical responses to gender-related distress in minor children, and the cost of taking a principled stand in a contentious crowd. Stella O'Malley, welcome to the podcast. It's great to see you again. For those who are unfamiliar with your work, what is the historical brief on Genspect, the organization that you founded? How did it get started? And most of all, who are your funders? Everybody wants to know that. So we might as well answer.
All right. Well, we started Genspect as a result. It was kind of a COVID story because I had been inundated with emails from distressed parents and other people who'd been impacted by medical transition from the time I released a film in 2018 questioning the trans medical scandal that's unfolding. And that was in 2018, but I never had time because I work as a psychotherapist. I was writing books. I just didn't, I had my own life really. And then COVID happened in March 2020, the lockdown, and suddenly I had time on my hands, and I had, plenty of time. And so I did what I'd been already asked to do by parents, which is, would you run an online meeting to help out parents whose kids have been identified as trans? And so I did. And as soon as I ran that first meeting was pivotal in my mind of understanding that something huge was happening. These parents were parents of very distressed kids. They had many diagnoses. They'd been in mental distress often throughout their childhood. They had lots of labels, lots of kind of special different educational needs. And then at the long end of a long line of diagnosis, they were suddenly found transfixed with gender dysphoria, and suddenly they were identifying as trans and seeking a fast track to medical transition. So I realized I was kind of sitting on something extraordinary, and that meeting turned into immediately a second meeting the next night and next night. Really, we've been at this stage, we run an online meeting for parents every single day since then, really. That was 2020. Not every single day, but pretty much most days there's a meeting for parents who've been impacted by medical transition or their children identifying as trans. So a year into me facilitating a huge number of these distressed parents, I kind of realized something has to be done. Like all these parents are in these secret networks, none of them are speaking to each other. It was an extraordinary time of secrecy, and they'd come to the meeting in the car or in the toilet or in hidden places in the closet, in the shower, so that their children wouldn't hear them. It was an extraordinarily strange and harrowing experience of realizing these families' lives have been ripped apart by their very distressed, vulnerable children who were insistent on medical transition when it was clear that they needed their autism dealt with, they needed their ADHD, they needed their anxiety, their depression. They needed a lot of help before they went near medical transition, if they ever should go near medical transition. So in the midst of all that, I founded Genspect a year later to kind of give rise, to kind of give voice to parents and to kind of say, this is what's going on. Okay, yeah, these children might want to medically transition. This is what their parents are saying. It's something very different. And I'm a psychotherapist, so I'm well used to the concept of you bring in the parent's voice into an understanding. If somebody has anorexia or OCD or any other condition that's traumatizing them, you bring in the parent's perspective because you get others' perspective. It's not necessarily the true perspective, but it's a very valuable input into the situation. And they had been discarded and they'd been dismissed and silenced. From that, as soon as we started Genspect, I didn't expect it to be such a success so fast. And by the way, we weren't funded anything. I had a friend called Alistair Gunn, and he did a really snazzy website because he's just a genius. It wasn't because we were funded. He's just really, really clever at websites. And it made us look like Coca-Cola. Now, at the time, I think we thought that was a great thing because it made us look really professional. And his work was very professional. And my own work was very informed because I had been immersed in this. I'd just done a master's on the subject. So I really kind of knew my stuff. And the combination of the two of us made us look amazing. And we allowed it to look very professional and amazing. But that was to our detriment because we didn't realize that there would be crowds of seething um, or people who were not happy to see this new kid on the block take so much energy. We didn't realize that. We thought we were kind of promoting a non-medicalized approach to gender dysphoria, so we thought people would be behind us, but we didn't understand that actually people were a bit irritated with us. You live and learn. And so within kind of almost within weeks, if not days of starting Genspect, we got a lot of requests from detransitioners. These are people who've been harmed by medical transition. They're recovering from their medical transition and they're trying to reverse the process. And they wanted help. So we kind of quite quickly realized it wasn't strong enough just to have the parents' voices. There was a whole other cohort who needed help, and that was the detransitioners. And whether I was right or wrong, I still don't know. But I decided to expand Genspect at the time to be just a healthy approach to sex and gender, just promote non-medicalized approach and not confine ourselves just to the parents' voices. I think the parents were a little bit annoyed with us because, arguably we should have stuck with the parents, but we were encompassing the parents and we were trying to do something bigger, which is a cultural shift, is what we're trying to change the hearts and minds, to inform the public that actually medical transition is a needless and harmful intervention, that there are many ways to be gender non-conforming and you don't need to do any sort of surgical or hormonal treatments. And actually, I would argue that it's actively harmful to do medical interventions. People can choose to do it. That's their choice. I think free choice is a very important principle in society. That doesn't mean that they should be recommended by clinics, and it doesn't mean it should be supported by the public purse or by hospitals. This is arguably body modification, extreme body modification. People do it with cosmetic surgery all the time. And I think it should come with a warning that, like, honestly, the long-term happiness of people who undergo these interventions is really quite questionable. These interventions seem to cause more harm than they do good. I know a lot of people report that they're very pleased with them and work away, that's fine. But if they're a child and if they're a vulnerable adult with a lot of mental health challenges, there are better ways to approach it. And so Genspect became very big, very fast. irritated an awful lot of people very fast. The trans activists came for us in a very professional, organized way, which I'll never forget. And so there was an awful lot of an onslaught of attacks. And we're still here. We're 5 years in now. And we have attracted primarily a funder who's a parent, and the parent is very generous to us since then. That's a kind of a pretty new arrival. And thank God we're very lucky with this parent funder, but it's not enough. We do need, I know an awful lot of like-minded organizations do get funding from different organizations who are concerned about it, and we would love to get funding because we really can't. I don't think we can operate in this kind of amateur fashion the way we do. We're professional in our work, but it would be really good to get some sort of solid funding.
You use the word distress. In your books, you write that learning to overcome distress is how the adolescent forebrain becomes an adult forebrain. Growing up is hard to do. Then, in your book about what parents can do when their kids say they are transgender, which you co wrote with Sasha Ayad and Lisa Marciano, you use the phrase gender distress. People can get upset about this term. What is gender distress, and how did it become the single most important source of stress in our culture, do you think?
People get very, very, very angry about the word gender. To me, I don't feel too much distress around the word gender. So arguably we're born male or female, and that is, dictated by our bodies. And then gender is arguably the manifestation of either femininity or masculinity. And some people, some women are feminine, some men are feminine, some men are masculine, some men are feminine. And then there's people who don't subscribe to either. I would say I'm kind of neither particularly feminine or masculine. I'd be a good example of not really. But, I do know women who are very feminine, and I do know men that are very masculine. So I don't think it doesn't exist. I think people who try and say that there is no such thing as masculinity or femininity, I frankly think that's ridiculous. I think there's been enough studies to show that there's certain female typical traits and there's male typical traits, and to call that a word, which is gender, is perfectly fine. I don't take issue with it. Gender distress, arguably, is the distress around the kind of imposition of those roles. And so I myself would have had what I think would be called gender dysphoria. I had it for years as a kid, from the age that far as I can go back. So, I'm 50 now, so it was a long time ago. But when I was about 3, and it lasted for many, many years, I wanted to be a boy. I presented very boyishly. I was much more, by the way, masculine than I am now. I was very, very, very masculine. I was very good at being a boy, and I hated girls, and I was very misogynistic. Hated everything feminine, really did, really disliked it. And puberty hit many years later, and that was pretty harrowing. I wouldn't underestimate it. It was a horrible experience. And it was just this sense of, why am I a girl? I don't want to be a girl. Oh, everything about being a girl just turns my stomach. I want to be a boy. So you could call that. Some people want to call that, I don't know, what is it? They call it sex dysphoria. I don't really see why you'd call it sex dysphoria. I think it was the roles, it was the femininity rather than the fact that I was a girl. It was the roles associated with it, and the body associated with it, and the look associated with it, and the behavior associated with being female. I don't know. It's all very debatable. I think when people get into the weeds of that, they're missing the massive medical scandal that's unfolding, where people are getting mastectomies that they don't need. People are getting phalloplasties that give them pain for the rest of their life. People are really, really in a severe pain. And do you remember I said earlier that we run, parent meetings almost every day of the year. We also run meetings for detransitioners, Genspect does, and I facilitated those. And so because of that, I'm seen in the cold face. I'm facilitating a few meetings a week, a couple of meetings a week. And these are people whose bodies have been really, really harmed by medical transition and whose lives have been massively um, hurt by medical transition. And, I remember one person, memorably saying, like, I don't care about pronouns. I'm just trying to stay alive. I'm busy trying to avoid sepsis. And so, you know what I mean? When you talk to people who are really in the real distress, they don't care about all that sort of stuff. But on that word, I do agree about the famous word gender. I do agree that it shouldn't be in any legal documents. It shouldn't be in any policies because it's like a word like cheerfulness or friendliness or shyness. Gender's like that. It's a nebulous descriptive word. Most people know when if I say somebody's a friendly person, there's a working understanding of what that means. If I say somebody's shy, if I say somebody's cheerful, generally you know. If I say somebody's feminine, you know what type of person I mean. If I say masculine, the same. It shouldn't be in statute books and it shouldn't be in policies. That's where it turns into a mess. So this whole abolish the word gender, I think, frankly, is ridiculous. But abolish them from statute books, yes, you should only be putting male or female in the statute books. It took me some years to come to this. I didn't, get into this with this understanding, but I've been studying it for years, and that's where I've landed, and I'm kind of comfortable with that. And we call it I call it gender related distress more than gender dysphoria, only because the taxonomy and the nomenclature of gender dysphoria is a mess. Like everything to do with this, everything is shifting, it's fast moving landscape. So, the ICD, which is the International Classification of Diseases, they call it gender incongruence, while the APA, the DSM, they call it gender dysphoria, which is the distress around your gender. I think the move is going to be towards gender incongruence. And because I'm anticipating that that's going to be the move, I just use gender related distress. You can call it whatever the hell you want. Mine is the most descriptive term.
And why do you think gender distress has been elevated over all other forms of distress in the last decade?
A good question, Matt. um, I've studied this in massive detail. It's a fascinating subject. It gets to the very heart of what it is that makes you you. When people want to change their entire body so that they present as a different person, it's an extraordinary act. And gender related distress, I believe, has been elevated because there's been a perfect storm of events. And there's quite a different, I probably won't be able to name them all. But for example, the gay rights movement, which had been very strong for decades, really since the 60s, had really successfully obtained a lot of funding post AIDS, the AIDS epidemic. And they wanted to keep their funding and they put the T onto the LGB. I think it was 1996 when that happened. And with that, they kept funding because suddenly they had a new frontier, they had a new issue to fight, and it maintained funding for an awful lot of NGOs around the world that all wanted to keep their job. I don't think that's necessarily a nefarious plot, but it doesn't mean that there weren't a few people who knew exactly what they were doing when they were putting the T onto the LGB. I think it happened. I remember when it happened, and I was actually, I was just, I had nothing to do with gender at the time, nothing to do with trans issues. And I remember I'd be in pubs in Dublin saying, why do they put the T on? That doesn't make sense. And I remember people not understanding what I was talking about. And I was thinking, I had known because I was a kid who'd had such an intense experience. I kind of, whenever I met somebody trans, I was like, oh, I remember feeling that and I don't envy them. So it would be like if you had OCD as a child and you met adult sufferers who had OCD as a child and still had OCD and their lives were ruined by OCD. You'd have a lot of sympathy and you'd have a lot of understanding and a kind of awareness of like, whoa, I remember that. That's so I think I kind of for example, I never believed in the true trans narrative because which is this idea that you've got some sort of trans within you. I never believed that because I knew what I'd experienced and I'd experienced something that was what I would consider a real mental health condition. And it was distressing and it was horrible. I didn't, people try to kind of reduce my experience to, oh, you were just a tomboy. And I'm like, yeah, yeah, I was a tomboy. I'm not saying I wasn't a tomboy. But most tomboys that I met were nothing like me. In fact, no tomboys that I met when I was a kid were like me. They were just, I don't know, wearing jeans, climbing trees, playing football. But I was in a dark place with it. It wasn't a light experience. It was a pretty horrible experience. It was a very horrible experience. It was easy when you're younger, but it wasn't a good experience. So I remember when I was, just as an aside, I remember when I was in my 20s, I remember being in a pub in Dublin. Most of my life in the 20s was in a pub in Dublin. And I remember thinking to myself, I'm going to stop telling people about how I was as a kid because they keep on just saying, "Oh, you were a tomboy," and me going, "Yeah, that wasn't really, that doesn't really describe what I'd gone through." So I stopped. There's a few different reasons. Gender identity as a concept kind of came through, frankly, kind of a pretty degenerate clinician called John Money, and as well as that Robert Stoller, who had this idea that they could socialize your gender identity. And if you were born if you started to socialize a child before the age of 2, according to John Money, you could socialize them feminine or masculine. And he obviously had very little understanding about hormones and the impact of testosterone when a boy reaches a certain age, and when a girl reaches a certain age, it absolutely shapes a huge amount of people's behavior and sense of self. But yeah, there's quite a few other things. Gender identity has taken a world of its own. It's not only because of the big gap in funding that the trans community kind of slipped in on, as well as that identity politics has risen for a variation of reasons, but like certainly queer theory and a lot of kind of academia, postmodern academia, really kind of worked itself into a hole, frankly, where the reliability of academic studies has gone to pieces. And at the same time, there's a massive emphasis on oppression, there's a massive emphasis on identity. And so the trans identity took a life of its own for a range of reasons, as well as that, in sync and in parallel, there's been a huge increase in diagnosis, especially around mental health conditions. And there's been a huge increase in a kind of an identity around a person's diagnosis. And so they're all like just various different confluence of confluence of events that created this perfect storm that elevated gender-related distress into this hugely important aspect of life, as well as that the polarization of the left and right, and the left's move from class politics into identity politics. Again, I wonder about funding around that, and why do they move from class politics to identity politics? Might it have been they wanted to keep working and keep talking about the victim, and they were seeking new victims, so they went into the victim identity victim emphasis, because the left has certainly, it's so irrational that the left is really at the forefront of pushing a big pharma, massive profit driven chemical industry that modifies people's bodies. It's kind of unbelievable that this has happened, but it has. And as well as that, there's this emphasis on identity with gender identity. And I do think that the trans lobby are really, really good at marketing, and they're really, really good at appealing to the hearts and minds of the public at a time when trauma bonding, and if it bleeds, it leads, and social media is a really easy way to go forward, is to, just talk about your pain and you'll get lots of clicks. And so, which, I'm really quite uncomfortable about, but it's a real issue. And that's, I think, elevated the gender identity, gender related distress phenomenon into the world.
There's one side of this debate in which we're fighting over the definition of woman. What is a woman? And then there's this other side of the debate where I think you have the most expertise, which is that we're fighting over the definition of a child. What is a child? We used to understand that children are too young to consent to chemical castration and surgical mutilation, but now we treat the child as this full grown adult who already knows who they are. to use the activist phrase. And long before I met you, you had made a reputation as an advocate for authoritative parenting, which is not to be confused with authoritarian parenting. Can you explain for the audience briefly what authoritative parenting is and why it's
Yeah.
important?
Yeah, thank you. I do think that parenting, you know, the way I said there was a confluence of events, another one was a loss of confidence among parents in their parenting and the rise of the parenting industry alongside the rise of the mental health industry, which kind of combined to make parents feel foolish and inept. And we left behind the idea of, you know, in the 1980s, mother knows best. That's gone. And the good enough parent, you know, described by Winnicott and others, that's gone. And instead, we're left with, you know, I blame the parents, and the parents are just a wreck. So we're in this world where there's a presumption that parents are doing harm to children, and kind of the state should be always at the ready, on guard to jump in and stop the parents from ruining their children. And it's again, it's overreach, but it's also a concept creep of everybody looking for the victim, everybody looking for the trauma, rather than realizing we've never been healthier, we've never had more education, we've never had more safety, we've never had more luxury and convenience than ever before. And rather than appreciating what we've had, we've gone into this postmodern overthinking. You know the way the mind can make a heaven out of hell and a hell out of heaven. We've really made a hell out of heaven, and it's overthinking. It's neurosis. Frankly, I'd love to bring it back as a word. It's a massive level of neurosis. And when you look into history, and I'm very interested in history, when you look into history, when the middle classes have too much time in their hands and they're not very happy, you know, dangerous things occur, such as anti-Semitism and other, you know, other mass movements, communism. Lots of them, you know, came from these kind of intellectual, educated people who are unhappy with their lot. And I do think we've never been richer, never been safer, but also there's never been so many daily frictions that we're up against. The bureaucracy of life, the kind of the administration pain of just living, I think has really, and you know, Hannah Arendt spoke about that, you know, after In the Banality of Evil and after the Nuremberg trials, she spoke about how all the bureaucrats coming together and creating a kind of an oppressive society is something to be watched. I agree with her. I think we are in a very bureaucratic, oppressive society that has created an awful lot of unhappy people. We don't need to be in that position, but we are in that position because it's societal. So if you want to book a train, you have to go through some sort of Kafkaesque hell to just book the stupid ticket, like, you know what I mean, rather than just saying train to Dublin, you know what I mean? Everything has become an awful lot of irritating frictions. And as a result, there's a lot of discontented, distressed people, and they're looking for somebody to blame. They're looking for somebody to blame. They're looking for somewhere to kind of direct their distress. And that's a dangerous combination, really. And I do think that this is something we should be very careful around.
You were also an early herald of the John Haidt school of thought, this idea that phones and safetyism have combined to destroy the mental health of our kids. They ruminate watching TikTok instead of going outside and growing up. And this is why I was interested to read your book on bullying, because the whole anti bullying movement really set the scene for this in an important way, certainly in America, because we nerfed socialization for kids. And it's probably will be controversial for me to say this, but kids require a certain amount of enforced social conformity, or else they turn into narcissistic, solipsistic monsters, right? So, how much blame do we assign to the rise of cotton wool kids, as you call them in your book, for this pediatric transition pandemic? Would it have been possible without the adults trying to cushion everything in life and remove all the bullies from their kids' lives?
Thank you for your question because I agree with you. I wrote my first book in 2015, but it was very much informed from having kids in 2007 and 2009 and realizing I'd stepped into this extremely neurotic world where I remember like just extreme levels of safetyism and frankly, a funless atmosphere that like it was always killing the fun, always killing the spontaneity, always very heavy level of bureaucracy, very heavy level of fear and paranoia. And I started reading about it. I remember when my second child was born, my son, and my husband was just cuddling him. The baby was 1 day old, and he was just cuddling the baby. And he walked outside the ward, and all sorts of alarms went off. And I was told, "Oh, you can't be too safe." And I was like, I remember thinking, but maybe you can be too safe. I remember thinking, I want to check that. Can you be too safe? Because I think you probably can be too safe. And yeah, that set me forth on a road, and I ended up writing Cottonwool Kids, and that was released in 2015. And the point was, yeah, you definitely can be too safe. Actually, if you wanted to make your child fully safe, you just raise them in a padded room and you'd never let them leave, and that would be very unsafe. So it's a paradox. Of course, you can be too safe, and children who are brought up in a world where all tension and conflict and shadow side of life is avoided end up Cottonwool kids, as I used to call them, the Kitty King in the nursery. They don't have any resilience. They don't, when you're a child, you're supposed to learn how to deal with conflict in the shallow water when your mother is around. So if you fall in the playground, you know what I mean, you hurt yourself and you check whether you need to run over to your mammy or not. And if you don't, you continue playing. But if you're living in a world where the parent jumps in the second you hurt yourself, you haven't learned to self soothe, you haven't learned to handle the fact that today, Matt, you're going to meet irritating things, and so am I. Every single day, you're meeting conflict. That is part of the experience of being human. And you need to build actually quite a lot of resilience because being human is pretty devastating. And I think life is beautiful. I think there's an awful lot of really beautiful things in life, but I think it's a difficult experience being a human if you're sensitive, and I certainly am. The fact that there's homeless people like living a few miles from where I am now, the fact that there's addiction and mental health, and we've never understood how to help all the devastated people in the world. It makes life very complex. And so, on some level, the children we're raising have to learn to deal with the fact that life doesn't make sense. We don't know where we've come from. We don't know where we're going. And it's incredibly unfair. And so, raising cotton wool kids is a really dangerous thing to do because these kids who are raised in cotton wool end up devastated when they face the bitter pill of reality. And they understandably, and I see a real golden thread between my book Cotton Wool Kids in 2015 when I had nothing to do with trans issues, and then later on, those kids who had so little experience in dealing with their own emotions. They were either medicated or they were diagnosed or they had somehow avoided conflict, maybe through their parents. Very often were the kids who were often fallen prey to transition. They kind of had this idea that there was all these golden people living golden lives and there was something wrong with them. A medical transition would give them another world, another life where they'd be happy just like everybody else. And it's like, no, 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 no. People aren't happy. People are just kind of finding their way through life. Sometimes moments of real joy, sometimes real fun, but sometimes it's really hard. And that's just a day in the life. And so after Cotton Wool Kids, that was a real success. It was only released in Ireland, but it was a big success in Ireland. And I up until then I was just a kind of a local psychotherapist, but I was asked to give a lot of talks, and everybody was asking me about bullying, and I didn't like the bullying industry. I didn't like it. I didn't like the way it was approached. I didn't like anything about it. So I wrote a book called Bully Proof Kids, basically emphasizing, dealing with tricky people is a gift for life, and you should be teaching your children that. And you asked me earlier about authoritarian parenting. Well, authoritative, no, you got me wrong there. Authoritative parent, I don't really use that word very often because it's such a irritating word because it's so easy to fall into authoritarian. But I'm very pro authoritative parenting or even confident parenting. You know what I mean? Loving parenting. I do think parents are usually the world expert on their kids. And I'd love to give more confidence back to parents to parent according to their own values and their own beliefs, because that's the whole idea of having children. You fall in love, ideally, and you raise children, ideally, according to the values and beliefs. And it's such an act of optimism to have a child. The idea is we're creating something together, which is maybe a demonstration of our love. and we're going to create a whole kind of little mini world in our family. It's kind of beautiful and it's very optimistic, and we've done it for millennia, you know. And I think if we're going to continue with this endeavor of raising children, we need to not lead them down this primrose path where they think that it's all going to be really easy. And instead, life is really complex and difficult and hard and still worth living. And so I wrote Bully Proof Kids really as a pushback against the bullying industry. I realized it was a shocking piece of information that anti-bullying programs in schools often leads to a rise in bullying. And I thought I can see why, because of the way that bullying is being spoken about. And so my idea with the concept of bully proof kids was raising your children to be resilient and to be able to face and handle tricky people, and to be aware that you're targeted with bullying. You're either a passive target just because you're an easy target, maybe just because there's bullies there and they see an in and they go for it, or maybe you're an accidental target because you're just in a certain place at a certain time, or you had a certain name in a certain. I remember, one friend of mine, and she was called a name just because it was somebody in the telly. And if there would been if she'd been called a different name, she would never have had the bullying she had. But because at that time that name was really a funny, silly name on TV. It was just accident of nature that ruined her childhood, and it really did. And then there's also the kind of provocative target, which would arguably be somebody like myself. And these are people who are truth tellers who feel compelled to speak out and have always been attacked because people don't like the people who speak out. They want to keep the status quo, and they find people like myself irritating. I remember my daughter's kind of similar to me, and I remember when she was about 10, she was having a fight with her mates, and I said to her, like, do you want to be happy or do you want to be right? And she kind of looked out the window and she goes, oh, I want to be right. And that would be the truth tellers. And I'm a bit like that myself. It's just this, and I think you have it yourself, Matt, this kind of need to tell the truth. And it does make us a target of bullies. And it's a difficult road to travel, but I think it's valuable. And so I outlined that in Bullyproof Kids and things like that, so that people realize, yeah, you might be a target of bullying, but you can still be yourself and find your tribe and find your way around pretty awful people.
Eric Erickson laid out the scholarship on the adolescent drive to individuate from our parents. It's as old as time, birds leaving the nest and all that. Trans seems perfectly designed to exploit the most difficult stages of human development, not just in kids, but also in full grown adults. I keep reflecting on how a man like Rachel Levin is in the same age range where men have historically turned to religion and become ascetics and monks and saints and prophets. And then Scott Nugent, in the memoir that I reviewed for Genspect, describes being in a vulnerable adult phase at the time of her medicalization. So it can happen to anyone. But kids go through a particular phase of magical thinking, and their brains aren't fully matured until their 20s, and they have full lives ahead of them. I live in a country where a child can reach the age of majority, 18, and still be restricted from drinking alcohol until they're 21, because we used to know this as a country, that adult brains are not done being shaped yet. And members of your profession basically had to unlearn everything they ever knew about human development in order to support this travesty. So, how did that happen?
Well, I am pretty crestfallen about my industry. I'm a psychotherapist. I really think we've lost our way. We lost our way in a whole series of events. I do think that to go back a long way, the Freudian psychoanalysis, it was founded on some pretty dubious theories, but lots of goodwill, arguably. And some people are very emotionally insightful, and they understand that by talking to people, that people can be better. I know in my own work, certainly I didn't become a psychotherapist until I was in my 30s, and I can see why I became a psychotherapist. I was that way inclined way before I ever studied it. I just was. I was very much a talk therapy kind of person. And so when I studied it, I remember realizing that there's a lot of people in this world that aren't really cut out for this job. And I became a therapist because I kind of was during my 20s, I went to a lot of different therapists, and I remember I used to think I could do better than this. I could do better than this. Not because they were so good. They were not because I'd be so bad, because they were so bad. I kept on thinking, I can't believe they said that. That's stupid. Why did she say that? That's mad. And I remember I became a therapist just thinking, well, I wouldn't be worse than the ones I had attended. That's one thing I was kind of confident. And I stand by that. I am not worse than the therapists I attended in my 20s. And I'm not saying that arrogantly. But if I have anything particularly special to bring to therapy. And I do think I'm a good therapist. I do seem to have a natural level of empathy. I just seem to have this ability to kind of be able to see what somebody's thinking and be able to stand in their shoes much easier than other people seem to be able to do it. I seem to do it just kind of almost reflexively. Now, I'm not saying I'm well aware of suicidal empathy and I'm well aware of toxic empathy and the difficulties around it, but it does go a long way when somebody fully understands you. It does. It really can. And if you can add to that some kind of well thought out analysis, you can really become a very effective therapist. But why did therapists lose their way? I think it became a culture, it became an industry. I thought Abigail Shrier's book, Bad Therapy, was brilliant. How we all became pseudo psychologists and pop psychologists and all the magazines from the 80s and 90s. It was always psychology, and everybody was kind of this half baked idea of what's going on for you. And I think it's become so popular that everybody's become a therapist, and then now nobody's a therapist. And the idea there was a concept creep from therapeutic process to therapeutic support. And a process is something that somebody would come to me for, which is you commit to a process. It's going to be difficult. It will cost you usually, and you will be committed maybe every week and maybe for at least 6 months, certainly for a certain level of time. And it'll be arduous. It'll be an event in your life. It should be a big event in your life. It should be life changing. And therapeutic support, which is what it's kind of crept into as a concept, it's a very different idea. It's making me a facilitator where I'm just nodding along. I remember when I was learning to be a therapist, when I was training, my lecturer talking about don't be a nodding dog, and she used to talk about the nodding dog therapists, and I was like, oh my God, they're awful. I remember them. They just nod along to everything you say. Effectively, she was talking about affirmative therapists before we were calling it nodding dog. We were very dismissive, and I knew exactly what she was talking about. It was one of the reasons why I became a therapist, because they were just nodding along. They weren't engaged. I could have said, I'm going off to the South Pole, and they'd nod. And then I'd say, no, I'm going to live in Mexico. They'd nod. I'm going to leave my husband. They'd nod. There was just no challenge. And it was actually very alienating and pretty depressing. And I hated it. Um, and somehow that has got ascendancy because of the reasons, arguably, I spoke about earlier, the rise of identity politics and this idea that your identity means more than anything. So, this, not only that, I forgot to mention there's a wave of kind of toxic positivity where if you're not in agreement and if you're not, you know, energetically positive, then you're causing a downer. That's another element that kind of is this confluence of a storm of events that created, the trans narrative that has become what it is. And I do think that therapists have been very badly impacted by the positive obsession that people have these days. It's a part of this soundbite consumerist culture.
Yes, there came a point when I was a graduate assistant a couple of years ago. I had this sudden realization that what I was being paid to do was actually to make these kids feel better, to give them a compliment, right? You have to give them a compliment. You can't just criticize them. You can't just count off because you got this wrong. No, you have to make them feel better about their performance somehow. And it just seems like everything was nerfed. Right up through college. And I thought, at what point do they become adults, right? At what point do we let them stand and fall on their own? We are also now seeing the consequences of no debate. The side that lost Scrimetti, that lost this recent Supreme Court case in the United Kingdom, that side struggles to articulate its perspective because it's been sort of retarded in its development, right? That argument has been allowed to weaken against opposition because it wasn't allowed to face opposition. And I said this would happen. I don't know if you read the dissent in Scrimetti. Sotomayor actually disappointed me. I had set my expectations very low and I was still disappointed. And you have written an essay about growing up in Northern Ireland and how the taboo on discussing certain things there played a role in perpetuating that violence. So, for our listeners who are just meeting you, could you maybe talk about that and explain how this fallacy of no debate works from your perspective?
Yeah, well, I grew up in Ireland, and part of Ireland, arguably, is Northern Ireland. And when I was growing up, we lived through the Troubles, and the Troubles were mostly centered up in the north. And it was a terrible time. It lasted many, many years. It started in the civil rights movement in the 60s, and that was basically Irish Catholic nationalists seeking fairness in jobs and in homes and things like that, very much inspired by the civil rights movement in America. But when they had some protest marches in the 60s, the English responded very violently, and from that it created 40-45 years of violence because there was attacks on both sides. So that's a very quick analysis of it, but effectively, I could give you a whole lesson, and I would like to give you a lesson in Irish history, but effectively, there was a border made in Ireland in about 1922. It caused the civil war in Ireland. That border didn't cause the civil war, but it was one of the problems around the treaty in 1922, and it was always a cause of trouble. When they actually had civil rights movements in the 60s, and this was on foot, there was a lot of them. Um, they they tipped into violence after 40 years of arguably oppression from 1922 to the 60s. And then they tipped into violence, and the IRA was formed as a result. The IRA caused a huge amount of real devastation. They bombed people, they kneecapped a lot of people, they really caused devastation. Then the UVF were the retaliation kind of organization, they were the Ulsters. And you know what I mean? So it became a disaster. But from about 1971, I mightn't have the years exactly right, but from about 1971, the UK put this censorship onto people who were in a political party called Sinn Féin, which was the political wing of the IRA, and they said they weren't allowed to be spoken to. And so, if ever Jerry Adams, who was the president, was speaking when I was a child, it would be a voiceover. It was never his voice. And it was just stupid censorship that I saw. And I was like, this is ridiculous. And it happened for many, many, many years, this censorship. And it was a disaster. Certainly for somebody like myself, I just thought this is a joke. But the big thing that I learned about it was that when all the bombings were happening, when I was a kid in the 1980s, and the men in the north, and they all went on hunger strike. Not they all of them, but many prisoners went on hunger strike for the right to be seen as political prisoners, rather than common criminals, and they died on hunger strike. And it was very, very kind of pivotal to my understanding of politics. And all the time, the UK kept on saying, British government kept on saying, we'll never speak to terrorists, we'll never speak to terrorists, we're never going to speak to the IRA, they're terrorists. And I used to think, why won't they talk to the terrorists? This is mad. Like the bombings, the hunger strikes, there was this thing called a dirty protest where all the prisoners were living on a blanket and they were wiping their feces on the walls because they wouldn't give them political status as prisoners. It was an absolute horror show, and children were being killed in this, and lives were being torn apart for, it was mayhem and it was murder and it was really depressing. And all the time, the British government was saying, we'll never speak to the terrorists. And I used to think, what are we going to do then? Like, just violence is continuing and continuing. And then finally, in the 90s, peace deals started to emerge. And finally, we got the Good Friday Agreement. And by the way, there was a bomb. Nobody was happy with the Good Friday Agreement. It was in 1998. Nobody was happy. Everybody was unhappy. It was an agreement that didn't please anybody. But it has maintained peace for the last 30 years in the North. So it's been a massive success that nobody's happy with. Okay. I'm not happy with it. I hate it. But it's maintained peace, so I love it. You know what I mean? And so I learned a lot of complexity and maturity watching all of that unfold over the years. And I think the same is going to happen in issues that we're facing these days politically, that you learn that you're going to have to give a bit and you're going to have to accept compromises you don't want to accept. But when it all came out that actually during the 80s, the British were speaking to the terrorists, they were lying to us. All of that censorship was posturing. All of that was just polish and pretense because they didn't trust the public with the actual truth. They were speaking to them all the way through. And I'll never forget the horror and anger I felt about that. It was like, what was all of that? It was lies. It was political lies. And I am still angry about that. I'm very anti-censorship and I'm very anti-people who just are hardline without realizing you're going to have to compromise. If you're married, you're going to have to compromise. If you've got a family, you're going to have to compromise. If you're living in society, you're going to have to compromise. It's a fundamental aspect of being human. And so I'm fervently anti-censorship and hardline puritanical authoritarian politics. And when I spoke up about the trans issue, I first wrote an article for the national media in Ireland in 2017, and then I did a film that was quite a big deal in 2018. And as a result, I got a huge amount of attacks from trans activists. And had they not attacked me, I would have just gone on. I just would have moved on into what I was into, which is psychological good health and writing about it. That's where my heart is and always will be. But instead, they very much prodded the animal in me because they tried to censor me, they lied about me, they tried to bully me, and they tried to silence me. And as a result, I'm now obsessed with it too. I'm doing a PhD. I founded Genspect and I'm ready to fight them all the way. Now, I had a completely wrong reaction. If they just let me alone, I wouldn't, there would be no Genspect, but they didn't.
You kind of got left holding the debate yourself with Genspect, all by yourself. Let's talk about the history of the counter movement to gender affirmation, because the term gender critical, it just describes the entire universe of people who believe that women exist, or about 95% of the human race. So there are always going to be differences of opinion in that category, right? That was a given from the beginning. And you set out to bring diverse views and perspectives together, and the resulting clashes of opinion were probably inevitable. But you were also oppositional to these institutional and activist forces that wanted to shut down any debate. So, what has changed about the organization, about you having gone through that baptism of fire from all sides? How has your view evolved in an environment where everything you do is criticized by someone?
Um, personally, I'm a much darker person. I'm not the better for it. I've seen kind of the worst of humanity in many ways in the last few years that I hadn't really been faced with previously. Um, I kind of think that you're right. Gender critical has become this ridiculous. It's almost as wide as trans as a word. Like everybody can be gender critical, but it's the word we have, so it's the word people use. It's not. I don't think it's a great word. I don't think it describes where I'm at. But I do think what was unusual about Genspect was a couple of things. One is that I'm not coming from the feminist perspective. I'm very much pro women's rights. I'm a women's liber. I'm a liberationist. I'm fervently pro women's rights, insofar as I think we're in I really think we've a lot to learn around breastfeeding and early childcare and things like that. And we really need to change society and support mothers. And I'd love to support mother and parents, basically, freedom to be at home with their children, if at all possible. But I don't come from the feminist theoretical perspective of the patriarchy and dismantling the patriarchy, the radical feminist perspective. And I don't come from the, liberal feminist perspective either. They just don't do it for me. They're very sociological, and they're based on what I would say are theories that are not uh, psychological enough for me. And that I didn't realize, by being a woman and speaking up about trans issues, I was immediately placed with the feminists. And the feminists were furious with me because I wasn't a feminist, really. I wasn't certainly a classical feminist in the ways that they were. And I certainly wasn't a trans activist, and I didn't agree with the medicalization of gender nonconforming people. So I was very much shot by all sides. And I know I'm still irritating people because I say that I don't agree with feminist theory. I know I'll get a few calls for this for that reason. So Genspect was just a kind of a middle of the road common sense approach, which is medical transition is causing harm, trans ideology is causing harm, uh, no debate is causing harm, censorship is causing harm, guilt by association is causing harm, tribalism is causing harm. A lot of things that, frankly, the ordinary person agrees with, and the extremes on both sides live by. They live by guilt by association, they live by tribalism, and I hate it. I'm a classic liberal. That's where I am. I just kind of, live and let live, so long as you're not harming other people, but don't be giving me your tribal crap. I'm not interested in it, and I don't like it, and I hate when people try to own us. And so I've had a really difficult, like you say, baptism of fire in this world. Had I known then what I know now, I'm not sure I would have involved myself in this world. I've really seen really toxic, negative, awful behavior. And I have a family, and they're lovely, and it's taken an awful lot of my time and my brain. And I think arguably I'd have been better off just not being involved.
I hate to hear that because I'm so glad that you got involved. You've done a terrific job. And the organization that you've put together has done such terrific work. Seeing you in Washington, D.C. in March with all those detransitioners, the moment has come when you're actually affecting policy. You're making change. And the people who criticize you, Lattice, they're not accomplishing this. This is not their work. They're not doing this. So, as far as I'm concerned, you were way better at turfing than most of the turfs, right? And let's talk about bullying a bit because there's so much of it. You wrote this book, Bully Proofing Your Kids, in 2018, which I read, and it was striking to me that the advice you give your parents with kids being bullied for their differences is the same that you give to parents with kids who are being bullied for their differences now. You tell parents to teach their kids to be assertive, to develop an internal locus of control and self-regulation, to manage their negative emotions. You tell them to teach their kids how to tolerate distress, how to develop resilience and critical thinking skills, and, find some healthy group they can belong to. It's all the same advice, or am I misreading that?
No, you're reading it exactly correctly. I think dealing with bullies is it's complex, and you have to have your sword and your shield with you, metaphorically. And that's what I tried to get across in Bully Proof Kids, that you've really learning how to deal with tricky people. It's really difficult because some people are very tricky, some people are very toxic. And also there's a certain level of when it's gone toxic, sometimes you might just say, this is not a world I want to be in because it's a pretty awful. So when they've dehumanized you, generally the argument is you should step out. So if your child has been dehumanized by children in the school and it's more dehumanization than anything else, that's a good rule of thumb of when to leave, because people often ask me that, when do you pull the kid out? And dehumanizing is the rule of thumb. So yeah, I did teach the parents who were often being bullied, and there's a lot of abuse going on. There's a lot of parental abuse going on that it's quite taboo. The parents don't want to talk about it because they love their kids and they don't want to talk about how abusive and vindictive and vicious their children are being. But some of the children are very vindictive and abusive, and it's something that should be spoken about. But as well as that, there's an awful lot of online bullying. I wasn't really involved in the online world until I became involved in trans issues. I had social media accounts, but I didn't really go on them. I just lived a very offline life. And I didn't know how to use Twitter. I wasn't fluent on Twitter. I just couldn't figure it out. So I kind of learned that when the film came out in 2018. That was the end of 2018. I learned how to use Twitter, and for better or worse. And yeah, online bullying has its own dehumanizing, insidious impact. And I think it is a new phenomenon, you know what I mean? And I'd love to do some more writing around that. And I'd say I probably will one day when this is less heightened and there's less going on. Just about the impact of the dehumanizing aspect of online worlds where you'd say things that you just wouldn't say in real life. And so it's a really sad aspect that has kind of moved to the fore because most people are living more online than they are offline these days.
Since we're on about bullies, let's mention the Southern Poverty Law Center. It happens that I am far too familiar with this organization, and it is like Stonewall in that its mission was accomplished a long time ago. And then it needed new things to denounce as hate, right, to keep on its mission. They also have this really bad reputation in progressive circles for just hoovering up all the money and just hoarding it and keeping it to themselves. So, they called you a hate speech organization. And it's a very strained report. It's full of misspellings and inaccuracies, which makes it actually hilarious. The work of the SPLC has declined. And the reality is that I've been to two Genspect events now, and I have not heard a single hateful word. I have, however, met a lot of parents who were bullied, children who were bullied, women who were bullied, some athletes who were bullied, artists who were bullied, doctors who were bullied, journalists who were bullied, therapists who were bullied. In fact, the whole conference is subject to bullying. You organize it on the down low, and there is heavy security, and you do a very effective job of this. So you have written about this kind of moral inversion, this DARVO, right? Deny, attack, reverse victim offender, and how it is intrinsic to all bullying. I am wondering, how have your personal political views changed as a result of these experiences? Like, what is your personal journey in terms of where you started and where you are now as a result of taking it from all sides like that?
The Southern Poverty Law Center, I don't even know why are they called Southern. I don't know anything about them, the Southern Poverty Law Center. Could you tell me who are they? I know they called us a hate group, they called Genspect a hate group, but I don't even know what they're for. What are they?
Originally, they were
Yeah.
started by a gentleman who sued the Ku Klux Klan successfully, I should say, for a lynching,
Wow.
a latter-day lynching, and bankrupted them,
Oh,
and perfected the art of bankrupting hate groups with lawsuits. So it was in the 1980s, something that, earned them a lot of hate. And if you go to their headquarters in Montgomery, Alabama. It is like a space station almost. It's this weird building that is far from the road. They have it set back so that no truck bomb can get close to it because there have been actual threats from, bloody-minded people. But the thing is that its job of tracking hate groups became kind of obsolete over time. One of the things that happened, and I will tell you this personally from my work, I won't say for, but with alongside the SPLC, was that when Obama became president, there was this narrative abroad that the world was full of new hate groups. There are all these new hate groups, and that means that hate was proliferating. But in
Hmm.
fact, what happened was when I checked it out personally, and it took years for me to figure out this particular trick, was that they had fooled themselves because the number of groups had proliferated, but the number of individuals had not increased. They just had more groups because the internet is a place where people fight with each other and go off and form their new group. So the same
Yeah.
person has been part of 11 different groups. And that's how you get 1,000 hate groups while actual hate is declining. So the SPLC had basically run out of emission, like Stonewall, as I say. And one of the things about transgender is how it came in with all of this money a decade ago. And of course, everybody wants that money. And the SPLC, they really love money. So they said, oh, yes, we can do something about transphobic hate. So
Oh,
there you
well.
are.
Thank you. Well, that's very interesting. Yeah, I don't think anybody who could look at Genspect's material could call us a hate group. Not anybody with any sort of intelligence anyway, because we're very thoughtful and we're very informed and we're motivated to be a force for good. And our mission is a healthy approach to sex and gender, and we're really trying to seriously promote a thoughtful approach to people who might have gender dysphoria. And we think the most thoughtful and the most healthy approach is a non-medicalized approach to gender dysphoria. And we're certainly well thought out. And I would say we're exactly the opposite of hate, if you follow me. That's not where we're at. Like we don't do attacks, we don't do side swipes, we don't do sly attacks. So it's wrong, is all I can say. We're not a hate group. They are wrong to call us a hate group. But as well as that, and I don't know, it was very interesting what you said about the kind of, the expansion of all the pseudo hate organizations. People, it has been done that hate as a concept has been extended to dissent and disagreement and not the same opinion as the person who's calling the person a hater. Hate has just become yet another concept that has, changed to a kind of an unrecognizable concept now, so that anybody who disagrees with me is a hater, apparently. It's very sad that so many words have been ruined. And when we had good, strong words to represent certain concepts and meanings, and now those words have been changed until they're this nebulous mass, and we don't even know what it means. And hate is one of those. And the hate speech bills that are kind of coming in across the world is an example of it. Like who declares it's hate? And am I free to hate a pedophile? You know what I mean? It's just the idea of banning hate speech when you know what I mean. Like if am I allowed to hate somebody who rapes me and murders my children? Is that am I free to do that? Am I free to speak about them in a hateful way? There seems to be an extraordinarily kind of authoritarian mandatory niceness that is being imposed upon the world, rather than understanding that the way we become a better world is by thoughtfulness and by being informed and asking questions and asking unpopular questions and being prepared to examine any concept that arises. So it's horrible that this has happened, and it's horrible that so many people are mindlessly falling in with these ideas without giving it a second thought. It's really disturbing. But I have seen hate on all sides, for want of a better phrase. I have seen bullying on all sides, and has it changed my political views? I think I'm a classical liberal, always have been. I don't think I've particularly changed on that. I've become more informed and more definitive. But I don't think I've changed my political views to answer your question. But I do think my worldview has has darkened.
You have another big Genspect conference coming up. Tickets are now
Mm.
for sale. I will be there because it is the
Oh, good.
single best networking event in our gender critical world. Uh,
Great.
tw- Twitter cannot give you the same experience. As you've written, virtual meetings can never have the same value as real face to face contact. Tell the listeners why they should come to Genspect and what they should expect there.
It's going to be a great conference. It's on in Albuquerque, New Mexico. As we're following what we've been doing for some years, we're following WPATH around the world, offering the bigger picture conference. We've called it "Live Not by Lies: Conversation for a Culture in Crisis." And we really are trying to promote the concept of living up by lies, live, honestly. And we're having, difficult conversations in this conference. Like we're holding, a lot of presentations from a range of speakers, some really, really interesting speakers. Dr. Lisa Littman will be giving her latest research. Great psychologists like Dr. J.D. Heltigan will be speaking, and there'll be a little bit about informed consent because Dr. Patrick Lappert will discuss the impact of trans surgeries, while Dr. Quinton van Meter will discuss the impact of hormones, which I think isn't given in complete detail the way it will be given at these conferences. Not only that, we'll have some detransitioners. Soren will be speaking as and giving a detransitioner's perspective, and Johnny, who's an extraordinary speaker, will talk about his story. There's Peter Boghossian will be speaking, and Graham Linehan will be there as well, talking about what just happened. And people like Logan Lansing, who'll be talking about the queering of America in educational terms, and Adam Coleman will be speaking about how our culture hurts our children. There's so many amazing speakers. Peter Boghossian will be talking about how to have difficult conversations. And then there's some new speakers, kind of unacknowledged, kind of great shining lights. And there's so many of them in our culture. Talking about, let's say, Dr. Lisa Duval jumps to mind. She has a great kind of insight in, she's a psychologist, in what the clinicians are missing when it comes to gender dysphoria. I think that's going to be a great presentation. There are so many really, really brilliant speakers that I can't wait for it. And like you say, there's something about when I really do urge people to consider coming, because when you go to these conferences, you come away the better for it. You feel nourished, you feel more able for the world. There's something about this online world. It's not healthy, it's not good for people. And I think it's really, really important that we kind of how would I say this? We start to meet more in person. If we want to be healthy, I think you have to give a commitment to meeting people in person more, because there's something about the online world that it leaves people dejected, alienated. And in these conferences, we're very heavy on the socializing. So there's a lot of socializing happens, and we really encourage it. Everybody mixes with everybody. Everybody's friendly with everybody. There isn't kind of VIP green rooms or any of that. What we're doing is we're very much mixing with each other, because we're so aware we are a culture in crisis and we need to come together. So it's going to be on at the end of September, and I welcome everybody who wants to come.
The food is also really good. I'm just saying.
Yes, it
And
is actually. Yeah, you're right. And the food is included in the ticket price, and so is all the refreshments and stuff like that. So it's a fully paid for weekend. And if you need a discount, contact us. But really it's well worth coming to.
and as you're saying, the people you meet there, I've met Andrew Gold, I've met Graham Linehan, I've met a ton of detransitioners, I've met Pitt parents and Helen Joyce, and I've met you,
Yes, I
Stella
remember. Yeah. It was
Stella O'Malley. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this full podcast. The Distance Discourse features voices that have been made politically homeless by gender identity ideology. Premium subscribers receive early access to our podcast interviews, as well as premium content and original reporting on this grassroots movement. Visit our website at www.thedistancemag.com to support our work with a premium subscription.